This is the fourth set of questions for the DP-900 as you practice for the Microsoft Certified Azure Data Fundamentals Certification exam, beginning with question 41. What is the primary goal of the third normal form in database normalization? To remove redundant attributes, to reduce data duplication, to merge tables together, or to make all attributes multi-valued? The answer to this is to reduce data duplication. The third normal form aims to reduce data duplication. It also seeks to avoid data anomalies, and ensure all references are valid. Question 42. Which SQL statement is used to remove data from a database? Remove, cut, delete, or modify? The answer to this is deletes. The delete statement is used to remove records from a database table. Question 43. Which common database object automatically performs an action when specific conditions in the database are met? A view, a procedure, trigger, or schema? So when specific conditions are met, the answer is a DB trigger. Triggers are special stored procedures that are executed when specific conditions are met, like after an insert, update, or delete operation. Question 44. Which of the following represents a two-dimensional table of data with rows and columns? A schema, a relation, a view, or a procedure? So the answer to this is a relation. In relational databases, a relation is a technical term for a table. And by the way, a tuple is a technical term for a row in a table. Question 45. Which SQL statement is used to add new data into a database? Select, add, update, or insert? The answer is insert. The insert statement is used to add new records to a database table. Question 46. Which Azure service is a fully managed relational database that provides SQL Server compatibility? Azure SQL Database, Azure Data Lake Storage, Azure Blob Storage, or Azure Table Storage? So the answer to this is, it's actually in the question right here. Azure SQL Database. Azure SQL Database is a fully managed platform as a service database engine that handles most of the database management functions such as upgrading, patching, backups, and monitoring without user involvement. Question 47. If a company wants to lift and shift its on-premise SQL server to Azure without any changes, which of the following would be the most suitable? Azure SQL Database, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines, Azure SQL Managed Instance, or Azure CosmosDB? So the answer to this question is lifting and shifting means an exact replica of the existing on-premise SQL database, and it doesn't say anything about fully managed. So in that case, if you want 100% compatibility and fully managed isn't a necessity, the answer to this would be SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. SQL Server on Azure VMs is ideal for lifting and shifting applications and databases to the cloud with minimal changes needed. Question 48. Which Azure service provides nearly 100% SQL Server compatibility, but also operates as a fully managed service? Azure SQL Database, Blob Storage, SQL Managed Instance, or CosmosDB? So unlike the other question, here we are looking for fully managed service. So therefore, the answer is Azure SQL Managed Instance. Azure SQL Managed Instance offers near full SQL Server compatibility with the benefits of a fully managed service. Question 49. What is a key benefit of using Azure SQL Database compared to SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines? Full OS level control, automated backup and patching, installation of third-party software, or physical server access? So the answer to this is automated backups and patching. Azure SQL Database is a managed service, which means makes tasks like backups, patching, and other maintenance activities automatically handled by Azure. Question 50. Which Azure service allows the hosting of MySQL, PostgreSQL, and MariaDB databases as managed instances? Azure SQL Database, Azure Managed Databases, Azure Data Factory, or SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines? So the answer to this is Azure Managed Databases. Azure offers managed database services for a variety of open source database systems, including MySQL, Postgres, and MariaDB, which are all part of CosmosDB, of course, but that was not listed as one of the options. Question 51. Azure's version of PostgreSQL as a fully managed service is called Azure PostgreSQL, Azure SQL PostgreSQL, that's a tongue twister, PostgreSQL on Azure Virtual Machines, apologies, Azure PostgreSQL Database. So the answer is Azure PostgreSQL. Azure offers a managed service specifically tailored for PostgreSQL named Azure Database for PostgreSQL. Which of the following does Azure PostgreSQL not deliver? Point-in-time restore for 14 days, built-in high availability, automated maintenance, or elastic scalability? So the answer to this is point-in-time restore for 14 days, because Azure PostgreSQL offers point-in-time restore for 35 days, not 14. If you wanted to run a MariaDB instance, this is question 53. On Azure without managing the underlying infrastructure, what would you use to run a MariaDB instance? Azure MariaDB VM, Azure SQL Managed Instance, Azure Database for MariaDB, or Azure MariaDB Lake? So the answer to this is Azure Database for MariaDB. Azure Database for MariaDB is a managed service that lets users run, manage, and scale highly available MariaDB instances in the cloud. Question 54. Which service supports the migration of on-premise SQL Server instances with minimal changes? Azure SQL Database, Azure CosmosDB, Azure SQL Managed Instance, or SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines? So the answer to this is Azure SQL Managed Instance. Azure SQL Managed Instance provides a path for SQL Server migration to Azure with minimal changes. Question 55. If you have a Linux, Apache, MySQL, or PHP application, what is the easiest way to migrate that application to Azure? Using Azure Blob Storage, Azure SQL Data Warehouse, Azure Migration Server, or Azure Database for MySQL? The answer to this is Azure Database for MySQL. The simplest method for migrating LAMP services, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, to Azure is Azure Database for MySQL. Question 56. Which Azure Database service is a NoSQL database service providing multimodal databases? Azure SQL Database, Azure Database for PostgreSQL, Azure CosmosDB, or Azure SQL Managed Instance? So the answer to this question is Azure CosmosDB. Azure CosmosDB is a multimodal NoSQL database service for large-scale applications. Question 57. For which of the following open source database systems does Azure not provide a managed database service for? MongoDB, Oracle, MySQL, or MariaDB? So the answer to this one is Oracle. Azure does not provide a managed service specifically for Oracle. Although Oracle databases can be run on Azure VMs, Oracle does offer an Oracle Managed Service for Azure customers, but that's not part of the DP-900, so just know that Oracle is not included. Question 58. Which of the following services provides built-in high availability and threat protection? SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines, Azure SQL Database, Azure Data Factory, or Azure Blob Storage? So the answer to this is Azure SQL Database, of course. Azure SQL Database provides built-in high availability, automated backups, and advanced threat protection. Question 59. We only have 2 more left. If you wanted to experience a fully managed relational cloud database with the power of SQL Server, which Azure service would you choose? Azure SQL Managed Instance, Azure CosmosDB, Azure Table Storage, or Azure Database for PostgreSQL? So the answer to this is Azure SQL Managed Instance. Azure SQL Managed Instance combines the best of SQL Server with the benefits of a fully managed service. And the last question, which Azure service is best suited for enterprises looking to combine their existing SQL Server database with new cloud-native applications? Azure Cosmos DB, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines, Azure SQL Database, or Azure SQL Managed Instance? And the answer to this question is Azure SQL Managed Instance. Azure SQL Managed Instance allows for seamless migration of on-premise SQL Server to the cloud, making it a great fit for hybrid scenarios. I hope that you got through these questions and found these very helpful as you study for the DP-900 Microsoft Certified Azure Data Fundamentals certification exam. I wish you the best of luck taking the exam. I'm sure you'll have a great success. And if you enjoy this video and want to see more certification exam questions, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.